Dear students, welcome to the lecture. Today, let's critically evaluate the utilitarian ideas of Jeremy Bentham, James Mill and John Stuart Mill. To begin with, utilitarianism has emerged as one among the most influential and widely discussed perspectives in normative ethical philosophy in the last 2 centuries or so. One of the key questions that is debated in normative ethical philosophy is that of right conduct. How can one be sure which is the right conduct? What makes a particular conduct the right conduct? How to differentiate between right and bad conduct? Different philosophical traditions offer different answers to such questions based on their core precepts. Scholars from the natural rights tradition like John Locke would argue that right conduct is that which conformed or did not violate the inalienable rights of all human beings. Immanuel Kant's deontological ethics would make the argument that right conduct is the one which can be universalized for all times and contexts without any violations of the autonomy of any human being. In the late 18th century and early 19th century, such debates on normative ethical philosophy were vigorously being pursued, as were many other philosophical questions, for this was the period of Enlightenment in the European continent. It is in such a context and amidst such an intellectual environment, utilitarianism emerges in the late 18th century and early 19th century in the works of towering philosophers like Jeremy Bentham, James Mill and John Stuart Mill. While it is true that a full-fledged expression of utilitarianism came about only during this period, it is also true that throughout the history of philosophy, one can find sporadic expressions of utilitarian premises by many philosophers and thinkers. However, despite such a long history, utilitarianism became systematically and clearly expressed only in the works of the aforementioned philosophers, who are therefore rightfully regarded as the pioneers of modern utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is a consequentialist moral philosophical tradition which subscribes to the notion that the morality of an action has to be evaluated based on its impact or consequences. This is in contrast to categorical moral philosophical traditions which argue that the morality of an action is located within the action itself in a categorical manner and its impact or consequences have no bearing on that. Kant's deontological ethics is an example of a categorical moral philosophical tradition which focuses on the nature of an action rather than its consequences to evaluate its morality. Utilitarianism, on the other hand, argues that the morality of an action lies in its consequence, specifically on whether it increases or decreases overall utility. Unlike egoism, which was focused on individual self-interest, utilitarians talk about calculating the net utility of all those affected by an action to examine its morality rather than looking at it from an individualistic perspective. Utilitarianism, therefore, is not focused on maximizing the individual good, but rather the net good in a society. It also seeks to be impartial and therefore values the good of every individual the same. Early utilitarians saw good as synonymous with pleasure, and this view continues to hold significance among utilitarians. Therefore, maximization of good is seen as synonymous with maximization of pleasure. This is what led to maxims like greatest happiness to the greatest number, becoming the clarion call of utilitarian tradition. Let us move ahead to critical evaluation of utilitarianisms of Jeremy Bentham and JSMill. Jeremy Bentham and his ardent follower JSMill had a broadly similar understanding of utilitarianism. Bentham believed that human motivations can be reduced to the simple logic of maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain. He saw pleasure and pain as the two sovereign masters of all humans. Utility is defined in terms of maximization of pleasure and or minimization of pain. Hence, the utility of an action or a policy can be measured by evaluation of how much it increases pleasure or minimizes pain. An action which does not increase pleasure and or increase pain has little or negative utility. Bentham even goes on to identify several kinds of pleasures which humans want to maximize and several types of pain which humans want to minimize. Bentham not only argued that human beings try to maximize utility, but also argued that maximizing utility was ethically justified. For Bentham, an individual needs to calculate the utility of an action by examining its cost benefit for all those who will be affected by it. Bentham argues that in such an ethical utility calculation, one has to be impartial to one's own net pleasure and that of others, as only the overall net calculation that should matter. Thus, Bentham's utilitarianism is concerned about the greatest happiness of the greatest number of people affected by a particular act or policy. This is why it is sometimes referred to as act utilitarianism, as it is an act that is being evaluated for utility. Bentham's calculation of utility is highly quantitative in nature. He considered individuals as real entities and the community as a conceptual fictitious entity, which is a collection of the real entities of individuals. Therefore, the calculation of the net utility of a community for him was nothing but the sum of net utility of individuals. Moreover, in order to aid a comprehensive calculation of net utility, Bentham gave the philosophic calculus, which gives 7 criteria to evaluate the utility of an act or policy. There have been several criticisms of utilitarian notions championed by Bentham and JSMill. Let us examine 5 major criticisms of Bentham and JSMill's utilitarianism. It is argued that Bentham and JSMill's utilitarianism sacrifices the rights of minorities or individuals in the name of greatest happiness of the greatest number. In fact, potentially any crime can be justified if it increases net social utility. For example, in a community, the majority might hate a wealthy innocent man and murdering him might increase the net pleasure of the community. There is nothing theoretical in Bentham and JSMill's utilitarianism, which will morally condemn such an action because it does not increase net utility and therefore under its tenets justified. Hence, if such a utilitarian logic is used to design political systems, it is argued that such systems will be majoritarian, leading to potential violations of individual and minority rights. So, critics claim that utility alone cannot be the sole basis for determining the morality of actions. A second criticism of Bentham and JSMill's utilitarianism is with respect to the lack of differentiation between different kinds of pleasures. Bentham treated all pleasures as equal, and the only difference was in quantity, which his philosophic calculus helped him to quantify. Bentham might have felt that this would enable a more neutral calculation of utility without any favoritism of one pleasure over another. Critics, however, argue that such a framework is not possible or even desirable to implement in a society as a community works, also based on values, and therefore some prioritization of pleasures and pains is unavoidable. Thirdly, critics argue that giving equal priority to the utility of all those affected by an act need not always be morally justified, as sometimes one might have special obligations towards a particular set of individuals or groups. Parents towards children, relatives, state towards its citizens, etc. Differential obligations are not taken into account by Bentham and JSMill in their calculation of net utility. Critics argue that this regards the differential location of people in social contexts, thereby requiring them to do prioritization. A fourth criticism of Bentham and JSMill's utilitarianism concerns its practicability. As noted earlier, Bentham believed that net utility of a society or people affected by an act can be calculated with reasonable precision and certainty. This was in line with the optimistic scientific spirit among Western philosophers in the 19th century, many of whom believed that they can scientifically study human societies. This optimism eventually turned out to be an exaggeration, and today there is a greater recognition of the limitations of objective studies of human societies. For Bentham and JSMill's utilitarianism to be operationalized at the level of society, large amounts of data need to be gathered and analyzed with accuracy before taking every policy decision. This might be simply impossible in most cases, and even if materially possible, the complex subjectivities involved in human societies make accuracy questionable. Critics therefore argue that utilitarianism is not always practical. This is a general criticism of utilitarianism which will be applicable to all kinds of utilitarianisms. Lastly, a general criticism of utilitarianism is with respect to its claims about human nature. Bentham and JSMill argued that human beings are motivated by maximization of pleasure and minimization of pain. Therefore, utility motivates human action. Critics question whether there can be any such universal motivation that can be applied on all humans. Even if human beings do what they want to do, how they define utility might be radically subjective, that net utility calculations might be impossible or ultimately meaningless. Moreover, there might be other emotions like love, sense of justice or duty, which might motivate human behavior rather than utility. Robert Nozick, the libertarian scholar, famously put forward his experience machine thought experiment in the 1970s, in which he suggested that if people are given an option to plug into an experience machine which will stimulate any kind of pleasures they want instead of living in the real world, most people would still choose living in the real world rather than having a pleasure maximizing illusion. Thus, he argued utility is not the sole motivation of people, as they value, in this case, authenticity, and in other different cases, likely many other different things. This criticism targets the core of utilitarianism and questions its validity as a universal philosophy. Dear students, now let us discuss the critical evaluation of utilitarianism of JSMill. JSMill employed his utilitarian insights to discuss many pressing issues of his day. Let us begin with Mill's refining of Bentham's utilitarianism. Firstly, Mill argued that one can differentiate and hierarchize pleasures, and society should incentivize higher order pleasures like education, art, music, etc., as opposed to the lower order pleasures like alcohol, entertainment, etc. The learned elite of a society can, through their experience, determine which are the higher order pleasures and which are the lower order pleasures. Maximizing pleasures should be therefore done in a thoughtful manner, focusing on qualitatively better pleasures. Secondly, Mill wanted to offer better protection of minority rights in comparison to Bentham's framework, which can be used for crude majoritarian impulses. So, he argued that the maxim of the greatest happiness of the greatest number should be applied to the rule or principle behind actions rather than actions themselves directly. And if the rule or principle provides greatest happiness of the greatest number for the greatest number of times, then it should be adopted even if on individual occasions the majority did not see greatest happiness. Thus, utility calculation should be made not on individual acts, but rather on rules behind those acts. This is why his utilitarianism came to be known as rule utilitarianism as opposed to Bentham's traditional act utilitarianism, and was seen as offering a rights utility synthesis. However, critics contend that JSMill's differentiation between higher and lower order pleasures is ill defined, and it is not clear on what basis one can make such a prioritization, as whatever basis one employs, it will be subjective to the persons or groups making those decisions. It might therefore be the case that people in positions of power or privilege will decide which pleasures are higher and which ones are lower. Secondly, critics argue that while JSMill's rule utilitarianism offered better protection of individual and minority rights in comparison to Bentham's framework, it still was based on net utility. This means that if a rule can be shown to benefit the majority, then it can still lead to violations of individual and minority rights. It is therefore likely beyond the scope of utilitarianism to provide full protection of individual and minority rights, as net utility is always going to be majoritarian in one way or the other. JSMill's greatest contribution to philosophy is likely to be his utilitarian defense of liberty. Mill was a great advocate for liberties of thought, expression, actions and associations. He argued that while individual liberties might not on every occasion be beneficial to society, on the whole, as a principle or a rule, they result in greatest happiness of the greatest number for the greatest number of times. With respect to freedom of thought and expression, Mill was an absolutist who believed there should be no constraints at all on individuals. Mill would give 4 reasons of utility for his free speech absolutism. Firstly, he argued that the majority need not always be right, and therefore their opinion, even if deeply held to be true, need not be true. Hence, suppression of minority opinions can lead to society being denied access to true opinions and benefit from it. He anticipated criticisms that will wonder about the damage caused by minority opinions, which turn out to be wrong. Mill therefore goes on to give 3 reasons why allowing even wrong opinions has social utility. First, he argues that suppressed opinions might have half-truths and the actual truth might emerge out of a dialogue between a variety of opinions. Secondly, he argues that even if an opinion is false, it is such false opinions that keep the truths living, as through constant engagement with false opinions, truths shine out better and do not become dead dogmas. Lastly, Mill argues that if truth becomes dead dogma due to suppression of all opposing opinions, we lose the meaning of truth, as people might not know why they believe what they believe. With regard to freedom of action, Mill distinguishes between self and other regarding actions. Mill argued that with respect to actions that have effect only on the self, a person needs to be given absolute freedom. The only actions which can be regulated are those which harm others. This came to be known as Mill's harm principle. Mill was against regulating actions which cause offense, as the harm has to be tangible and physical rather than a mere offense of sentiment or feeling. Mill argued that the existence of such freedom would promote diverse experiments of living, and through some of them great ideas, perspectives or inventions can emerge, benefiting the entire society. Mill also defends freedom of association, as it can lead to different experiments of collaboration, some of which might outshine governmental actions. Ultimately, one can argue that Mill's defense of utility assumes that freedom is important for individual development, mentally and socially, and as a principle or rule. Individual development will lead to net social development, thereby contributing to greatest happiness of the greatest number. Mill's defense of liberty has been critiqued from several perspectives. Firstly, critics contend that Mill's defense of absolute free speech, based on the notion that truth emerges out of a dialogue, essentially mimics Adam Smith's idea that in the market the best product shall win. Mill too believes that in the marketplace of ideas, if one lets all ideas engage with each other, the best will win. This was likely never true for economic markets themselves, as sometimes bad products can deter over better products due to chance or good marketing. More importantly, this need to be true for Mill's marketplace of ideas, as many times bad ideas can draw a following, drowning out truths. Ideologies like Nazism, fascism did gain people's support. Similarly, while suppression of all opinions is definitely not desirable, suppression of some extremely harmful ideologies like Nazi or racist ideologies might be actually beneficial for the society. There seems to be no way of doing that in JSMill's framework. This is especially true to multicultural or plural societies, wherein communal harmony is also an important social good, and hate speech can disrupt communal harmony, thereby harming social utility. Moreover, with respect to speech as well actions, some critics also argue that the line between harm and offense is not always clear. For example, racially or socially demeaning speech can cause mental harm, which might not be tangible in nature, but can be as hurtful, especially on historically oppressed communities. Further, with respect to Mill's distinction between self and other regarding actions, once again critics contend that the distinction between which actions constitute as self-regarding as opposed to other regarding is not very clear in many cases. Alcoholism or drug abuse may be a self-regarding action from one perspective, but it can also have familial and social dimensions and cause. Therefore, critics argue that while Mill's defense of liberty provides useful insights, a plural or multicultural society with complex social layers has to be implemented with caution and care, tailoring it for their societal specifics. Dear students, to conclude, utilitarianism continues to remain as an important philosophical tradition despite all such criticisms. However, these criticisms do point out limitations of the early utilitarianisms of Bentham, JSMill and JSMill. Subsequent utilitarian thinkers have sought to refine utilitarianism in response to such criticisms with varied degrees of success. Dear students, I hope you gained some knowledge on the unit of utilitarianism. Thank you and take care.